There's this thing called calorie dilution. It's where you're essentially eating as much as you want, but the foods that are available to you are so nutrient dense and much less calorically dense that you arguably could eat as much as you want until your heart's desire and could ultimately lose more weight than if you were just restricting calories to a set number. It's called calorie dilution versus calorie restriction. And if I were to put you in a room right now with amazing food that you want, cakes, pies, steaks, pizza, whatever, but I put a number and a cap on how much you could eat, okay? And then 2 weeks later, I put you in a different room and I said, hey, eat as much as you want of all of this food, no limits, but the food is high in fiber, high in protein, it's nutrient dense. How do you think you'd fare? It's a solid question. It's not necessarily like any trick question. Like, do you think you'd control yourself better in sort of a defined like line of where you need to stop? Or do you think you'd do better if you just ate as much as you want and it was full of nutrients and full of fiber and protein? Who knows? Well, this study's set to find this out. And I'm going to set the record straight and help you understand some of the scientific jargon that has a hard time getting articulated on social media sometimes. So let's go ahead and dive in. And after today's video, I popped a link down below for 25% off of Seed's Synbiotic. No matter what you're doing, if you're on a weight loss journey, you're trying to build muscle, taking care of your microbiome is important, and Seed is literally the only probiotic I would ever recommend because they have legitimate science behind them, they have multiple peer-reviewed studies behind them, and they have a cool technology with that prebiotic and a probiotic capsule inside of a capsule technology, which makes it very unique and very distinct to them specifically. Plus, they just put their money where their mouth is on research, even if it doesn't necessarily support them. That's the tried and true test of a brand that really cares about the research. So that link down below gets you 25% off. I think you'll notice it within a couple of days. I did. I noticed my appetite changed. I noticed my bowel patterns had changed. It's very effective, and if you stick on it, you notice it a lot too. So that link is down below, and a big thank you to Seed for the continued support on this channel for making all this content possible. First, caloric restriction versus dilution. Caloric restriction implies you can eat whatever you want as long as you put a boundary up on your calories, okay? Calorie dilution does not restrict the amount you can eat, but it restricts what you have access to. Calorie dilution essentially restricts your intake by restricting your access to things that are super dense and increasing access to things that don't have a lot of density, higher volume foods, proteins, higher satiety foods, things that sort of, for lack of a better term, dilute the calories with things that are not calorie dense. In the case of the study we're going to talk about, they just use flat out cellulose, indigestible fiber that they could like intersperse into chow, essentially. Now, in theory, calorie dilution would lead to caloric restriction, right? Because you would eat so much of this stuff, eventually you'd just be full. It's like if you were eating a bunch of like, you know, I don't know, like shipping popcorn, like you'd be filled up, right? Anyhow, the study was published in Cell Metabolism, and it was done in mice because you can't do this kind of stuff in humans without putting them in a metabolic ward, and there's just not enough people for that kind of cohort. Anyhow, what they did is they took mice, and for 30 days at first, they put them on an ad libitum sort of standard diet to develop a baseline. Then after this, they went 3 months and divided into 3 separate groups: a control group, a caloric restriction group, and a calorie dilution group. Now, what did these look like? The calorie restriction group, what they did is they found, okay, well, how much energy do these mice normally absorb? And let's kind of put them there. That way we know what they're actually using and we'll consider it caloric restriction. Calorie dilution was able to eat as much as they wanted to, ad libitum, as long as it followed these parameters: 10% protein, 35% carb, 5% fat, 50% cellulose. And you'll quickly find out that although that sounds like a ridiculously low amount of protein, and it is, it's diluted, right? Because the control groups and the caloric restriction groups were eating double that. They were eating 10% protein, 70% carb, and 10% fat, right? So all they did is literally dilute it. That's what makes this so interesting. Hey, eat this in caloric restriction. We're going to give you a defined amount. Hey, eat this exact same amount that's just diluted and eat unlimited amounts. The results were pretty darn fascinating. It really showed us a lot. Calorie dilution did trigger a pretty significant increase in intake. Those mice ate a ton more, a lot more volume. But what was interesting is that they did not eat enough to offset the diluted portion from cellulose. So in other words, they did not eat 50% more. So they did not out-eat the dilution. But because they still ate more, even though it was diluted, it resulted in a net lower caloric intake than even the caloric restriction group. And then for about 9 days, they let them eat. And it took 8 or 9 days for them to stabilize again, to get back to normal kind of eating levels on a normal diet. What's interesting is that both caloric restriction and calorie dilution had very similar body composition changes over control. So things were very, very similar there. What they noticed though, and we'll talk more about this in a little bit, is that the gene expression associated with hunger hormones and hunger cues was very different between caloric restriction and calorie dilution. The caloric restriction group was showing signs of true hunger, starvation. They're expressing genes showing we're frickin' hungry, right? Whereas the calorie dilution group, even though they were eating about the same, even less in some cases, as far as calories were concerned, the gene expression they were having was completely different. They weren't having starvation cues, even though they were eating less. The other thing that was interesting is that calorie dilution ended up increasing fat utilization. They actually were starting to oxidize more fat. What this really shows us is that there's other aspects outside of caloric restriction, because they're both restricting calories, but in slightly different ways. But one is actually oxidizing way more fat than the other, and their macronutrient ratios essentially are the same. One's just very diluted. It tells us that it's not just calories in, calories out. And hate on me all you want. I'm not saying calories in, calories out isn't probably the most important thing that we know of today, but I am saying there's clearly more going on. And if you deny that there's more going on, you're living in 1970. There is more going on. We just don't understand it. But here's where the things get really interesting. The metabolic rate, okay? So at 34 days, the caloric restriction group and the dilution group had about the same metabolic rate. They both had a decrease in their resting metabolism above control or below control. Okay, so they definitely slowed down their metabolism. But as this went on further, at 40 days and beyond, the calorie dilution group had a higher metabolic rate. So in the beginning, everyone's metabolism slowed down, except for the control group, because boom, reduction of calories. But as time went on, the dilution group actually maintained their metabolic rate, and the restriction group continued to go down. Isn't that wild? Even though the dilution group was eating roughly the same amount as far as calories, possibly even less, yet they maintained their metabolic rate. We don't have answers for this. We don't know why. But something about the act of eating, the act of constantly being able to get volume of food in. And in this particular case, it's even more wild because there wasn't the argument of more nutrient density. If you and I did that, and we put Bob in a room with Twinkies and pizza and this and that, and you and I went into a room with fiber and protein and good healthy food, we also have the argument of saying we got more nutrient density, so maybe we're healthier and our metabolism's better. This didn't even apply to these mice because there was no more nutrient density, it was just diluted calories. That's what's so damn wild. How can we take what we know here and apply it to us as humans? Well, for one, the quickest way that you could probably dilute your calories is with protein, because both of these groups saw reductions in fat mass and lean body mass. However, the calorie dilution group saw a slightly better preservation of lean body mass, because for whatever reason, I don't know. But if we dilute our calories with protein, we can have a double whammy. We dilute our calories and we get protein synthesis, muscle protein synthesis. We defeat the muscle protein breakdown and we preserve and we maintain our metabolic rate above and beyond what we might have even seen in this literature. The other thing we have to look at is the caloric restriction piece had these insane gene expressions associated with smell and sight and visual cues of food. Everything that linked to these mice are starving. Okay, whereas like I mentioned before, the calorie dilution had gene expression associated with adaptation, not with starvation. They were adapting to lower calories because their body was like, hey, this is cool. We're eating, we have food. It goes to show us that having food available changes things. The restrictive mindset, okay, restrictive eating patterns is ineffective in a lot of ways beyond just what's happening here, but truly chemically as well. And it goes, again, if we eat nutrient-dense food, fiber, veggies, protein, lean protein, wholesome food, we can send these signals to our body that we're healthy, we're vibrant, we can recover. We can eat more and be alive while still losing weight. Sounds like the most sustainable way you could possibly lose weight. Where things get tricky though, is that there was a study published in Nature Metabolism that found that calorie dilution was not the best thing when it came down to longevity. Okay, now the reason behind this is because they found that caloric restriction was imperative for longevity in this particular study, and it was done so via periods of prolonged fasting. So they would restrict calories and trigger these metabolic effects, all these things related to glucose metabolism, insulin resistance, autophagy, overall just mitochondrial health, metabolism to begin with. So what we see with this is that periodic extreme deficits, or I shouldn't even say extreme, periodic deficits are required. So what's the deal here? Perhaps what it looks like is having periods of calorie dilution, or your bulk of your life being calorie dilution, with just defined periods of caloric restriction via fasting, versus I'm gonna restrict calories by 10% every day for the rest of my life. It's more so like, hey, eat as much as you want, but eat good food, eat real food, not hydrogenated oils, not weird industrial oils that have been oxidized. I don't even have a problem with seed oils. I have a problem with industrialized garbage, adulterated oils that are cueing us to eat way more than we should, when in reality, just eat the food. Like if you cook ground beef, there's fat in the ground beef. Cook the beef in the ground, its own beef, like who cares, right? You see my point here. Eat as much as you want and then take defined periods of just not eating. And that might be the result that you're looking for, because we all know that fasting is caloric restriction. Okay, so at the end of the day, if you get there via just relaxing and not being obsessive about it, this is going to be the most sustainable way for you to lose weight. So stock your fridge with the real food, the fiber, the protein. Stop worrying about the intermediate stuff that's just messing with your head. As always, keep it locked in here on my channel. I'll see you tomorrow.